There are secrets in English history that were never meant to be spoken aloud, secrets buried under stone, sealed by royal order, and carried only by those too afraid to tell the truth. One of them belonged to a woman named Margaret Dymoke, a name so ordinary that even historians almost forgot it. Though her eyes saw the last 19 days of Queen Anne Boleyn, and her hands recorded every word the Queen spoke before the sword fell, she was not a friend. She was not a maid of honor. She was a spy, Thomas Cromwell's spy, sent to the Tower of London to watch the Queen die, to write down her confessions, to help craft the story that would justify her execution. But instead, she watched something that no one could explain, something that haunted her for 40 years until she died, with the truth still locked inside her chest. It began in May of the year 1536, when the world around the Tudor court trembled under the shadow of Henry VIII's rage. The king, who had once broken with Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, now wanted her gone, erased, unmade, turned from queen to traitor. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, had built a case out of whispers and forged evidence, out of tortured confessions and jealous ambition. But even Cromwell knew that if the people were to believe this, if the king himself were to sleep at night, someone respectable had to watch the condemned woman and confirm her guilt. That was why he chose Margaret Dymoke. Her family had served English kings for generations. Her bloodline was loyal. Her husband, Sir William Coffin, was Anne's own master of the horse. She could walk into the tower without suspicion. No one would question why she slept at the foot of the Queen's bed. Cromwell's orders were simple: sleep in her chamber. Listen to everything. Write down anything that could be twisted into guilt. But orders are easy when they are written on parchment. They are harder when they echo in a room where a woman weeps herself into silence. Margaret entered the tower with her head high, proud to serve justice. Within a day, she wasn't sure she still believed in justice at all. The tower was not a place of chains and screams in those days. It was colder than that. It was quiet. Anne's room was bare, her bed heavy with tapestries, the air damp and close. Two women shared that chamber with her, Lady Boleyn, her aunt, and Margaret Dymoke. They took turns sleeping on a low pallet at the foot of her bed, so close they could hear every turn, every sigh, every half-formed prayer that slipped out in the dark. Lady Kingston slept outside the door. No man entered. But the walls had ears, and those ears belonged to Cromwell. At first, Margaret wrote dutifully. She described Anne's erratic behavior, her laughter, her sudden tears, her constant questioning of what crime she had committed. But there was something wrong in those reports. They did not sound like guilt. They sounded like disbelief. Each night, Anne asked the same question. Why? Why does no one tell me what I have done each morning? She woke with swollen eyes, calling out her husband's name, not in fury, but in confusion. Henry, what have I done? She spoke to God as if God might send her the answer. Cromwell would not, and when she prayed, she did not beg for forgiveness. She begged for understanding. That was the first time Margaret felt her loyalty shift a small tremor under the weight of duty. She had seen Anne at court before. Dazzling, clever, too bold for her own good. The woman before her now was not the same creature of rumor and danger. She was a mother. She spoke of her daughter Elizabeth constantly, asking that someone ensure the child was not forgotten. She worried about her servants, about the horses, about her husband's soul. She remembered his songs. She remembered their early love, as if it still lived somewhere beyond the tower walls. And Margaret, whose job was to record these things as evidence of hysteria, began to write differently. Her pen lingered on the Queen's piety, her calm, her fragile humor. Without realizing it, she was building a record that contradicted everything Cromwell needed her to prove. But the strangest thing was the way Anne spoke in her sleep. Margaret would lie awake, listening to the Queen murmur half-sentences, fragments of prayers. Henry's name, the word mercy, and then wake suddenly, frightened, clutching Margaret's arm. "Did I say anything important?" she whispered. "Did I say something they can use against me?" That was the moment Margaret understood the terror of the innocent. Guilty people do not fear their dreams. Outside, London carried on. Inside the tower, time turned thick as candle wax. 19 days stretched into an eternity of watching, listening, writing. The Queen was told that one of her musicians, Mark Smeaton, had confessed under torture. She was told her brother had been accused of lying with her. When she heard it, Anne's face broke, not into guilt, but into disbelief so pure that even Margaret looked away. Mark said what she whispered. "That's impossible." Where her voice fell into a whisper, "I am never alone." It was not what Margaret had expected to hear. She had come to see a monster and found a mirror. A woman condemned not for what she did, but for what she symbolized. Anne was the price of Henry's shifting heart, the sacrifice that would cleanse his conscience and open his path to another wife. And Margaret, chosen to watch her, was a witness trapped between faith and horror. Each night, she wrote to Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, as instructed, but her reports had changed. They no longer fed the machinery of execution. They questioned it. She described Anne's long hours of prayer, her refusal to curse the king, her dignity, even in despair. She wrote of how Anne spoke kindly of people who had betrayed her, of how she smiled at her ladies, so they would not weep, of how she asked for Mass each morning. She wrote of how Anne's greatest fear was not death, but that her daughter would forget her voice. Cromwell never noticed the shift. He read her words, searching for guilt, and found none. But he did not realize that Margaret's silence was her rebellion. She would not accuse. She would not lie. She could not save the Queen, but she could save the truth. On the morning of May the 19th, when Anne was led to the scaffold, Margaret walked behind her. The spy who had been sent to record her downfall now carried her body to the chapel after the execution. No trumpet sounded. No priest sung. Only 4 women wept, and one of them was the woman who had once believed she was serving justice. That is how Margaret Dymoke became the quietest voice of resistance in Tudor England. A woman who saw too much, who wrote too carefully, who knew that truth could not be spoken without a price. For 40 years, she carried that secret. For 40 years, she kept the reports safe, buried in the archives where Cromwell's lies would one day rot. And when she finally died, the words she had written, words meant to condemn, became the evidence that Anne Boleyn had been innocent all along. The Queen died. The spy survived. But the silence between them would echo through centuries. The nights in the Tower of London were not silent. They never had been. Not even in the old legends where ghosts drifted through walls and kings paced the battlements in chains. In reality, the nights there were made of colder sounds, the quiet scrape of iron on stone, the groan of timber under centuries of pressure, and the shifting of women who did not sleep, because sleep was no longer safe, in one chamber above the yard, behind a heavy wooden door that no man passed without permission. A queen lay awake in a great carved bed, with curtains drawn around her like a shroud, and at her feet on a narrow pallet, Margaret Dymoke lay with her eyes open, listening for every breath. Because she had been ordered to. She was not there to comfort. She was not there to pray. She was not even there to serve. She had been placed in that room to record, to listen, to remember, and to write down everything that Anne Boleyn said, especially the things said in darkness, in terror, in sleep. It was not a position Margaret had asked for, but it was one she had accepted. After all, her husband, Sir William Coffin, had served the court loyally, and Cromwell himself had chosen her. The Dymoke name stood for loyalty, but Margaret, though born into obedience, had not yet learned how it felt to be ordered to watch a woman unravel. The chamber was small by royal standards, high-ceilinged but bare, with the scent of damp fabric and crumbling stone clinging to everything. Lady Boleyn, Anne's aunt by marriage, was also there, taking turns with Margaret in the long ritual of waiting. One of them always slept, or pretended to. One of them always watched. Lady Kingston slept just outside the door, the Queen's final guard. No one else came in. No one else wanted to see what Cromwell needed someone to write down. On the first night, Anne did not sleep at all. She lay under her canopy, stiff as iron, speaking aloud to no one and everyone. "Why won't they tell me what I've done?" she asked the shadows. "Why is no one telling me why I'm here?" She did not wail. She did not curse. Her voice was too calm for comfort, and too broken to be called sane. Margaret heard the bed creak with every movement. She heard the words repeated again and again like prayer. Except this was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a question shouted into silence. Anne had once been the woman who made kings beg. She had rewritten religion. She had survived exile and insult and exile again, risen to the crown through fire. Now, Margaret saw her reduced to something smaller, not weaker, but stripped. There were no robes now, no court, no music, only the questions, and the fear beneath them. At some point in the night, Anne began to sleep, if sleep was what it could be called. She murmured Henry's name in her dreams, but not with longing. The name came out strangled, torn from a place of panic. Henry. Why was all she said. Again and again, softer each time. Then came the prayers, fragmented, mumbled, like pieces of broken glass. She prayed not for salvation, not for release, but for understanding. She asked for strength. She asked for clarity. She asked for God to explain what no one else would. Margaret did not move. She lay still, her breath shallow, and felt the weight of what she was hearing settle in her stomach like lead. She had heard women pray before, but not like this, not with such quiet desperation. Not as if the act of speaking to God might be the only proof she still existed. And when Anne suddenly sat upright, her skin slick with sweat, and grabbed Margaret's arm in the darkness, her voice was more child than queen. "Did I say anything?" she whispered. "Did I say something they can use?" And Margaret, who had been sent there to catch Anne in lies, found herself unable to answer. In the mornings, she wrote her reports. She sent them to Sir William Kingston, as ordered, dutifully noting Anne's words, her moods, her moments of calm and collapse. But the reports began to change. She no longer wrote with the sharp eye of an investigator. She wrote with the hands of a witness. She still followed Cromwell's instructions, at least on the surface, but beneath the ink, another story was being told. Anne was not mad. She was not cunning. She was not confessing in riddles. She was unraveling in the quiet. Not because she was guilty, but because she had been locked away without a reason that made sense. She was not asking how to escape. She was asking what sin she had committed to deserve this. And Margaret began to understand that what she was hearing was not the downfall of a queen, it was the crucifixion of a woman who had been too inconvenient for too long. One night, Anne asked about Margaret's husband. "William," she said, smiling faintly. "Is he well? Are the horses still being cared for? Is he managing things at court?" Margaret could not speak. William, the man Anne still trusted, had helped Cromwell plan this, and Margaret, his wife, was lying in Anne's chamber like a shadow with a quill. And yet, Anne's concern was genuine. Her face lit up when she mentioned him. There was no bitterness, no suspicion, just the simple, human trust of a woman who still believed that kindness might survive betrayal. Margaret sat in silence that night, unable to sleep, not because the floor was cold, or the wind howled outside the tower, but because the guilt she had been assigned to catch was nowhere to be found, and yet here she was, listening, waiting, writing, for whom she had thought she would be bearing witness to justice. But justice did not look like this. Justice did not wake screaming, or whisper God's name in the dark, like a child lost in the woods. Justice did not ask again and again, "What have I done?" and never receive an answer. And Margaret, who had always followed orders, began to understand what it meant to disobey, not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, with every stroke of the pen, with every word left out of a report, with every moment of compassion. She allowed herself in the space between duty and conscience. The darkest part of the night in the Tower of London was not the hour itself, but the way the silence settled between breaths, the space where sound became memory and memory became unbearable. It was in those hours, when the candles burned low and the moon gave up, trying to shine through the black clouds, that Anne Boleyn began to speak in her sleep, not loudly, not with clarity, but with a kind of fragile rhythm, the half-sentences of someone too exhausted to guard her mind and too broken to stop trying. Margaret Dymoke had been trained to listen. That was why she was there. That was why Thomas Cromwell had chosen her, not for her sympathy, not for her steadiness under grief, but because she knew how to stay still, how to let silence do its work. But silence is dangerous when it turns into understanding, because in the darkness, Margaret was beginning to hear not confessions, but cries, not guilt, but fear. Anne muttered names, sometimes Henry's, sometimes God's. She spoke in fragments, as if still bargaining with people who had already left her behind. And then she would go silent again, not asleep, not awake, caught in a place that Margaret began to recognize as worse than either. Once, Margaret leaned closer, barely breathing, trying to catch the syllables that had tripped out of Anne's mouth. "Not alone, never alone," Anne whispered, and Margaret froze, because those words did not belong to a seductress or a traitor. They belonged to a prisoner who still believed she might be condemned by her own unconscious mind. Anne was afraid of her dreams, afraid that her mouth would betray her in the night, afraid that Margaret was listening, and Margaret was. The next morning, Anne asked again. She had asked before, and she would ask again. "Did I say anything last night?" Her voice was quiet, almost embarrassed. Anything strange, anything they could use. And Margaret, who had once told herself she could do this job without mercy, found herself saying, softly, "No, Your Grace, nothing at all." It was a lie, but it was the first lie Margaret had told in weeks that didn't feel like treason, because Anne had said something, not a confession, but a prayer, tangled in dread, Please, let them not find something I never meant to give. She was fighting her own thoughts now. And a guilty woman does not fear the things she says while sleeping. A guilty woman guards her lies while awake. Anne was afraid of herself, and that fear was the most damning evidence of innocence Margaret had ever witnessed. Every night, the same pattern. Margaret would lie still in the small bed at the foot of Anne's, listening to the slight rustle of sheets, to the Queen shifting, sighing, whispering, and each time, she would hold her breath, praying, yes, praying that Anne would say nothing, that nothing would be twisted or misunderstood or taken as proof. Because Cromwell did not need truth, he needed material, and in the absence of actual crimes, even dreams could be dangerous. Some nights, Anne would ask questions in her sleep, not to anyone, not even to God, just out loud, to the walls. Did he believe me? Did he ever believe me? Or was it always a lie? She wasn't accusing. She was unraveling. The voice of the woman who had once reformed England's religion was now barely audible, her sentences thinning like a thread pulled too long. Her questions had no bitterness in them, only confusion, and that confusion was the clearest sign Margaret had yet, that everything Anne was accused of had never happened. There was one night, one unforgettable night, when Anne woke gasping, drenched in sweat, her hands clawing at her own chest as if trying to tear something loose. She looked around the room wild-eyed until she saw Margaret, and then her voice broke. Did I say something? Did I say the wrong thing again? She was pleading now, begging, and Margaret, rising slowly, placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "You said nothing. Your Grace. You slept quietly." Another lie. A holy one. Because truth was no longer the thing Margaret served. She had once been Cromwell's instrument, but now, she was Anne's only shield. Even if Anne did not know it, even if her only weapon was silence, Lady Boleyn began to look at Margaret differently. The older woman had become distant, colder, perhaps convinced that the game was already over, that the Queen was lost and nothing could be salvaged. But Margaret had not yet given up, not because she thought she could save Anne from death, but because she could still save something of her dignity, something of her truth, something that no courtroom or executioner could erase. Each morning, Margaret wrote to Kingston. As she had been ordered, she still wrote the words, but she began choosing which ones not to write. She left out the muttered prayers, the confused dreaming, the name Henry whispered like a question with no answer. She left out the tears Anne shed in her sleep, and instead, she wrote about the Mass, about Anne's devotion, about the way she smiled faintly when reminded of her daughter. She wrote of Anne's poise, her moments of clarity, her grace under grief. She was no longer documenting guilt. She was archiving innocence, one line at a time, and in doing so, she became something more dangerous than a spy. She became a witness. There are wounds that never draw blood. Betrayals so quiet they don't echo until years later, when it is far too late to scream. The Tower of London held many such moments, tucked inside its damp walls like ghosts that refused to fade. But for Margaret Dymoke, the worst of them came not with a sword, or a sentence, or even a death. It came in the soft, merry, thoughtful voice of Anne Boleyn. One afternoon in that stone chamber, where both women were trapped together, one by law, the other by loyalty, it began with a simple question. Anne had been quiet that morning, no tears, no outbursts, only the pale stillness of someone caught between exhaustion and surrender. She had been staring at the tiny barred window, where a thin line of gray sky stretched into a world she would never walk through again. Margaret was seated nearby, pretending to sew, pretending not to watch, pretending she was still just an observer. When Anne suddenly turned toward her and asked, "How is your husband?" The question was light, almost cheerful. Anne's eyes brightened the way they used to back when she stood proudly at Henry's side, before the court whispered, before the charges, before the scaffold crept into every shadow of her day. "William, is he well? Has he been riding? I remember how proud he was of that white stallion. Has he written to you?" Margaret couldn't answer right away. Her hands froze. Her heart, which had endured 19 nights of whispered confessions and sleepless fear, clenched tighter than it ever had. She looked at Anne, this woman she had been sent to destroy with ink and silence, and saw no hatred in her. No suspicion. Only kindness. Only affection. Only the kind of simple human decency that made Margaret want to vanish into the floor. Because William Coffin, the man Anne was asking after, with such warmth, had stood beside Cromwell. He had not just nodded quietly as plans were laid, he had helped place her here. He had aided the process, perhaps not fully knowing what it would become, perhaps not daring to imagine that it would end in execution. But still, he had not stopped it. And now his wife sat at the Queen's feet, recording her last days like a scribe writing a death sentence. And Anne didn't know. Anna still trusted him. Anne still thought of William as a friend. Margaret swallowed hard and forced a small smile. "He is well," she said softly. "He asks after your grace often." Ali, but the only one she could offer, because to tell the truth would have been a cruelty Anne had not earned. A cruelty Anne had already suffered enough of. She expected Anne to nod and move on. But instead the Queen's face softened. "He was always kind to me. I never felt judged in his presence. You're lucky, Margaret. Some men are shadows pretending to be light." Margaret said nothing. She could not. Her throat had closed around something shapeless and sharp, and the words she might have spoken were trapped somewhere beneath her ribs. The silence stretched, but Anne did not seem to notice. She was smiling now, lost in some memory, perhaps of a simpler court, before the music turned bitter, before the gold became iron. It was not a long conversation, only a few lines, only a handful of words, but they tore through Margaret like nothing else had, because the truth was unbearable. Anne had no idea that she was being watched, not just by strangers, but by those she still loved. She was speaking about a man she had defended, cared for, trusted, never knowing that his wife had been placed in her chamber to listen for anything Cromwell could twist. And Margaret, for all her discipline, for all her noble training and loyalty to crown and duty, could not unhear those words. That night, she did not sleep. Anne prayed, as usual, quiet and steady. Lady Boleyn snored faintly on the far pallet, and Margaret lay with her eyes open in the dark, staring up at the low wooden beams of the ceiling, wondering how many lies one woman could carry before something inside her broke. She had told herself again and again that she was simply a witness, that she was doing her duty, that she was not the one swinging the axe. But now it felt different, because now the Queen had looked her in the eye and spoken kindly about the very people pulling the ropes behind her downfall, and Margaret had smiled and nodded and said nothing. She began to write differently after that. Her reports still went to Kingston. She still obeyed the form of the command, but the heart of it shifted. She stopped noting Anne's agitation. She stopped emphasizing the things that could be misread. She began writing about Anne's dignity, her steadiness, her concern for others. Her words no longer supported the case. They began to undermine it gently, carefully, but unmistakably. She could not save Anne's life, but she could begin preserving something the crown could not erase. It was a kind of treason, small, silent, and unspoken, but it was all she had. And in the years to come, those altered reports would outlive them both. But for now, in that chamber, Margaret kept her place at the foot of the bed. She rose each morning. She listened each night. She watched a queen die by inches and said nothing, because the truth was not safe, but neither was silence. And between the two, Margaret now understood, lay the weight of history. The tower had its own stillness before dawn, not the peace of sleep, but the quiet of restraint, if of breath held too long, of a heartbeat waiting for the world to shatter. That stillness was heaviest just before the priests came. It was in that fragile silence, when even the ravens outside seemed to fall mute, that Anne Boleyn would ask for Mass. Not once, not as a last-minute appeal, but every day, as if ritual were the only thing keeping her soul from crumbling in her chest. Margaret Dymoke had seen piety before. Courte piété, pageant piété, the kind of religion that looked beautiful in tapestries and predictable in sermons. But this was something else. Anne did not perform. She did not weep in front of the crucifix or beg for deliverance. She knelt on the cold stone, silent, still, lips moving not to impress witnesses, but to reach something higher, or perhaps just to hold on to something inside herself that hadn't been taken yet. At first, Margaret recorded these prayers like everything else. Dutifully, she wrote that the Queen asked for confession, that she requested the presence of a priest, that she took the sacrament, but she did not know then what that meant. She did not yet understand what it meant for a woman accused of adultery, incest, and treason, to kneel before her God and swear innocence not to the court, not to Henry, but to heaven itself. In the 16th century, communion was not metaphor. It was not a gesture. It was a living, trembling line between salvation and damnation. To take the sacrament while knowingly lying, while carrying unconfessed mortal sin, was believed to bring eternal judgment. Not political disgrace, not royal punishment. Hell, forever. A condemned soul before God. And Anne knew this. Everyone knew this. Margaret, born and bred of Old English nobility, had been raised to believe it too. So when Anne rose early that morning and asked for the sacrament again with only days left before her execution, Margaret expected hesitation. She expected fear. Instead, Anne walked to the center of the chamber with calm steps and lifted her hands to receive the host with a kind of stillness that silenced the entire room. Lady Kingston and Lady Boleyn stood behind her, Margaret beside them. The priest was pale, reverent, uneasy. Anne kneeled. She closed her eyes, and then, before receiving the sacrament, she did what Margaret would never forget. She spoke, not to the room, not to the priest, to God, and to the women who had been recording her every breath for the past 19 days. "I swear before heaven," she said softly, but clearly, "that I have never been unfaithful to my lord the king, never conspired against his life, never committed the sins they have placed upon me." Her voice did not tremble, and then she received the body of Christ. Margaret could not breathe. It was not a performance. There was no trembling, no begging, no desperation. There was only a queen, kneeling in judgment, not before a tribunal, but before eternity, and speaking the truth of her soul. A lie in that moment, under those conditions, would have meant damnation, and Anne had no reason left to lie. She had already lost everything. Afterward, the room was silent. The priest left. Lady Kingston turned away, but Margaret remained rooted to the stone floor, staring at the spot where Anne had knelt, her ears still ringing with the sound of that vow, not because it was loud, but because it had been impossibly calm. That night, Margaret could not sleep. Anne did not speak much. She sat by the small table, brushing her hair slowly, fingers gentle. She looked like someone no longer concerned with the day. She asked Margaret for nothing. She did not ask if she had said anything strange in her sleep. She did not ask after Henry. She was past that now. Past the fear of false charges. Past the hope of pardon. She had accepted that she was going to die, and she wanted to do it clean. Margaret lay in the bed at the foot of the Queen's once again, but she no longer listened the same way, because the woman in the bed above her was no longer someone she had been ordered to record. She was someone Margaret had come to believe. The transformation was not sudden, but this moment had sealed it. Margaret had expected madness, or guilt, or hysteria. But she had seen instead a woman take the most sacred oath a Christian could make at the edge of death, with her execution already being prepared, and do it without blinking. And Margaret knew in her bones, in her blood, in the part of her soul that had always served kings without question, that no guilty woman would dare do what Anne Boleyn had done that day. The tower was quiet again. Anne was asleep, but Margaret Dymoke had begun to change. She had entered the tower to record a guilty queen. Now, she knew she was watching an innocent woman, a woman about to die, because no one wanted to hear what she had just said aloud. And so Margaret did what she could. She sharpened her quill. She lit her candle, and she wrote it down. The question stopped coming. For weeks, Anne Boleyn had asked it, over and over, in daylight and darkness, to the stone walls, to the women who served her, to Margaret Dymoke, who wrote everything down. Why is this happening to me? She had whispered it into the candlelight. She had murmured it into her pillow. Sometimes it came out as breath. Sometimes it came out as prayer. But always, it was a question without answer. And then, one morning, just a few days before the end, Anne stopped asking. Something had shifted. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't despair. It was quieter than either of those things, a kind of inner stillness, the kind Margaret had only ever read about in stories of saints and martyrs, in the old books where women died, not in fear, but in fire and clarity. Anne had not been granted justice, but now she was reaching for something else. Not escape, not pardon. She wanted to die well, from the outside. It was a subtle transformation. She no longer paced, no longer wept, no longer asked if the king would send for her. Instead, she began to prepare, the way one prepares for a coronation, or a wedding, or a storm. Each detail mattered. She asked to see her confessor, not once, but many times each day. She took communion again. She prayed longer. She rose earlier. Her movements became more deliberate. Her words more measured. As if she were already imagining herself in the afterlife and didn't want to carry any of this confusion with her. Margaret watched from her corner, silent. Anne spoke less of Henry now. When she did, it was not in anger. It was in memory. She spoke of the early days, when he had written her songs, had chased her down with letters and gifts and impossible promises, How he had told her he would build a new church for her. How he had stared at her hands when she played music. How, in the beginning, he had made her feel chosen, not caged. She did not speak of her miscarriages as failures. She called them griefs. Each one was a soul I lost. She whispered one night, and each one took something from us both. Though he would never say it. She did not blame him, not directly. And Margaret understood that this, too, was a choice. Anne no longer needed to be angry. She had passed beyond the emotions of court and king. She was now walking a narrower road, one that ended in silence and steel, and the final dignity of composure. She began to speak of forgiveness, not dramatically, not for show, but in passing. She forgave the men who had accused her, even though she knew they had lied. She said it without bitterness, without hope. She simply knew that if she carried their sin with her to the scaffold, it would weigh her down. Margaret remembered one moment in particular: Anne, seated by the window in her plain gown, hair unbraided, speaking softly to no one. I cannot hate those who feared for their lives. If God is just, He knows they were weak, not evil. Margaret did not write that down. She could not, because something about it cut too deeply, because she, too, had been afraid. She, too, had once believed she was doing the right thing. But now, as she watched Anne kneel for hours in prayer, sometimes until her knees bruised on the stone floor, she began to understand the difference between doing your duty and doing what is right. Anne asked for simple things in those last days: a clean shift, a piece of cloth for her hair. She asked Margaret once, very quietly, "Will you help me dress when the time comes?" And Margaret, who had watched her sleep, who had written her words like a spy, only nodded. It was not a favor. It was an act of penance. No one came from the king. No message. No stay of execution. No final audience. Only silence. Anne seemed to expect that now. She had stopped waiting for mercy. She had chosen something else. Instead, clarity, grace, and preparation. She had begun to imagine her death not as an injustice, but as a stage, not for herself but for her daughter. I want Elizabeth to hear of this one day, she said one afternoon, looking Margaret straight in the eye. I want her to know I met it with strength, not because I am brave, but because I am hers. That night, Margaret wept, alone, silent, her face turned to the cold wall, not for Anne, not yet, but for the truth. She could not stop anymore. She had come here to record guilt, and she had found instead the most terrifying thing of all, a woman determined to die without shame, even if the whole world believed she deserved it. The next morning, Anne rose early. She asked for her confessor. She took communion. She asked to speak with no one else. She spent the rest of the day alone, writing, praying, preparing. Outside, the guards spoke in whispers. Inside, the candle burned low. And Margaret, now, fully changed, fully shaken. I began to write her final reports differently. There were no accusations left to record. Only grace. Only peace. Only the last, quiet preparations of a woman about to make her death mean something. Not for the king, not for the court, but for the child she would never see again. The dawn of May, the 19th, in the year 1536, broke over the Tower of London with an uncanny stillness, the kind of silence that comes not before a storm, But before an execution, the courtyard was already being swept, the scaffold already dressed. It stood quietly in the middle of Tower Green like a stage no one wanted to look at too closely. And above it, in the Queen's chamber, Anne Boleyn was awake, not because she had been roused, but because she had never truly slept. She had been ready since the night before. Every item chosen, every word rehearsed. She had spoken no more of Henry, no more of mercy. The prayers she whispered in the hours before dawn were not for pardon, and not for deliverance. They were for composure, for clarity, for the strength to die as herself. Margaret Dymoke stood nearby, hands folded, watching each movement as if it would be the last thing she ever saw. Anne's shift was fresh. Her outer gown was dark and modest. She wore a small cloak lined with fur, simple and dignified. There were no jewels, no crown, only the thin white linen she had chosen to wear beneath her hood, the same hood she would remove before the sword fell. Margaret's hands trembled as she helped arrange Anne's hair. The Queen had asked her directly the evening before, "Make it easy for him. Tie it high. No tangles." That was Anne Boleyn's final concern, that her executioner would have a clean line for the blade. Even now, she thought of the man who would kill her, and sought to make his task easier. It was not submission. It was something far more terrifying: grace. Lady Boleyn and Lady Kingston stood in silence. They had dressed the Queen. They had wept in private. But now they, too, held their breath. Anne, by contrast, was calm. She turned to each woman in turn and thanked them. Her voice was clear. It did not shake. She was ready. The door opened. The guards stood solemnly, their eyes fixed forward. No one dared speak. No drumbeat. No trumpets. No priest. Only the slow, deliberate sound of Anne's slippers against the stone floor as she walked from her room for the last time. The sky outside was pale and brittle. The scaffold waited. The crowd had been kept small. Only those deemed necessary were present: dignitaries, soldiers, clerics, a few nobles who did not know where to look. But the women, Margaret, Lady Boleyn, Lady Kingston followed close behind. Anne mounted the steps without help. She stood before them all, hands clasped, eyes steady. She wore no veil. She did not collapse. She did not cry. She spoke the words expected of her, words written by others, chosen for queens, designed not to challenge the king's judgment. "I die, the king's true wife," she said. "God save his majesty, and send him long to reign over you." She did not deny the charges. She did not protest her innocence. She did not give them the drama they wanted. But Margaret knew what those words meant, because she had heard the real confessions, the ones Anne had given to God, not to courtiers. She had watched her take the sacrament, watched her kneel in silence for hours, watched her forgive those who had condemned her. She had helped her tie her own hair out of the way for the blade. There was nothing more to prove. The French executioner stepped forward. He had been brought over days earlier, chosen for his skill, for the promise that he could do it in one clean stroke. Anne turned. She knelt. Lady Kingston handed Margaret the blindfold. It was linen, simple and clean. Margaret's hands would not stop shaking. She knelt beside Anne, murmured something no one could hear, not a prayer, not a goodbye, just sound, because silence now felt unbearable. Then she tied the cloth across Anne's eyes. The Queen adjusted her own gown, and then the sword fell. No scream, no struggle, only the sudden absence of breath. And then the women moved. Margaret was the first to reach her. She did not think, did not hesitate. She stepped forward and gathered the body. Lady Boleyn lifted the head, cradled it in the same arms that had once held Anne as a baby. Together, the four women jailers, spies, cousins, traitors carried the remains away in their own arms. There had been no coffin prepared, no ceremony, no guards to help. The crown had done its part. The rest was left to them. They wrapped Anne in white cloth. They laid her to rest in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where so many others had been buried by decree. Not mourning, but they mourned her. And for Margaret, it was the first time in 20 days that she cried openly, not for what she had seen, but for what she had written, for what she had been complicit in, and for the quiet, burning knowledge that she had just witnessed the execution of an innocent woman who had met death more honorably than any of the men who had condemned her. That night, the tower was silent again. Anne was gone, but Margaret Dymoke could not sleep, because no report she would ever write could undo. The image now burned into her memory, a woman kneeling calmly beneath the sky, whispering grace into the cold. Just moments before being taken from the world, the scaffold was cleaned by midday, the block scrubbed, the cloth folded away, the traces of blood scrubbed from the stone with water that would never quite wash the memory out. Anne Boleyn was buried with no procession, no rites, no mourning bells, only four women who wept as they lowered her into the earth. And then the tower moved on. Guards returned to their posts. Courtiers began whispering about Jane Seymour. The court did what it always did in the aftermath of a royal death. It swallowed it, buried it, and rewrote it. But one task still remained, one duty unfulfilled. Margaret Dymoke had to write. She had spent 20 days listening, watching, transcribing. She had dutifully sent reports each evening to Sir William Kingston, to Thomas Cromwell, to the silent machinery of Tudor justice that never stopped moving. No matter who screamed beneath it, she had recorded Anne's laughter, her weeping, her confusion, her prayers. But now, in the quiet after execution, Margaret had to compose the final report, the official record of Anne Boleyn's last hours, her dying words, her behavior at the scaffold, and she could not bring herself to do it. Not at first. She sat at the desk in the same chamber where Anne had once knelt for hours in prayer, where she had whispered to God with such clarity that Margaret could still hear it in her dreams. The quill was in her hand, the paper before her, and she stared at it, paralyzed not by fear, but by grief sharpened into resolve, because Margaret now understood what few others did that words could kill, or they could remember, and she would not let Anne be forgotten in the words of her enemies. She began to write, not with rage, not with rebellion, but with precision. She described how Anne had woken early, how she had dressed herself with care, how she had received the sacrament with solemnity, swearing once again before witnesses, and before God that she had never betrayed the king. Margaret included Anne's final words, spoken at the scaffold. But she also included what had never been asked for her grace, her composure, her spiritual strength. She wrote not of guilt, but of dignity. She wrote not of hysteria, but of faith. She wrote of Anne's concern for her daughter, of her refusal to speak ill of those who had condemned her, of her request to make the executioner's task easier. Margaret understood the risk. The line between fact and treason in Henry VIII's England was thin as silk and twice as deadly. A word out of place could mean a knock at the door in the middle of the night, a summons to the council, a place on the scaffold herself. But Margaret did not lie. She did not accuse the king. She did not defend Anne outright. She told the truth exactly as she saw it, quietly, faithfully, and that, in itself, was enough. When Cromwell read the reports, he did not question them. He saw a woman doing her duty, but what he failed to see, what only history would reveal, was that Margaret had planted a different story, a subversive story, a story that would survive when the official narratives had faded. Because Margaret was no longer a spy. She had become a witness. The woman who had once listened for scandal now preserved something sacred, the soul of a queen who had died with more courage than anyone had expected, and more innocence than anyone wanted to admit. The final page of her report ended not with a summary of charges, but with a single, devastating observation that Anne Boleyn had prayed for her child as she walked to her death, that her lips had moved, silently, just before she knelt, and though no one could hear the words, Margaret knew what they were. She had heard them often in the darkness of that chamber. Watch over Elizabeth. Margaret signed her name, folded the paper, sealed it, and sent it away, knowing that this, not the sword, not the sentence, would be the last thing she could give Anne. Not justice, not salvation, but memory. Anne was dead. Margaret lived. But the report was more than ink now. It was her final act of rebellion, not shouted, not published, but hidden in plain sight, buried in royal archives, waiting for someone, someday, to find it. And centuries later, they did. She never spoke of it again. Not to her husband, not to her children, not to her friends in the slow, passing decades that followed the summer of execution. Margaret Dymoke returned to court, to country estates, to the quiet responsibilities of a noble woman's life. She smiled when required. She listened at the right moments. She accompanied Sir William to formal functions, accepted the nods of passing gentlemen who remembered her name. She grew older. Her hair turned silver. The Tudor court moved on, but the truth never left her. She had spent 19 days in a room with a dying queen. She had been asked to listen, to spy, to write, and to hand over the soul of another woman like it was a line item on a list. She had done what was asked, and then, at the very end, she had done what her conscience could no longer refuse. She had written Anne Boleyn as she truly was, not as Cromwell's propaganda demanded, not as Henry's betrayal required, but as a woman who died without shame and without guilt. That memory, that version of Anne, was Margaret's burden. And in Tudor England, where a wrong word could be interpreted as treason, it was a burden she could not share. She remained silent for 40 years, not because she was weak, but because she understood the game. She had watched what happened to those who spoke too soon, too boldly, too close to the fire. She had seen what power did to loyalty, how easily a head could be cut from its shoulders by the very hands that once offered favor. Margaret had done her part. She had left her record. She had wrapped Anne's body in clean linen with her own hands. She had carried the Queen's head in her arms. And when the world turned away, she had carried memory. Time passed. The court forgot Anne. Henry remarried. Elizabeth, the daughter they had once called a bastard, grew up, quiet and cunning, eyes too sharp for her age. And one day, after blood and flames and death had circled the crown more times than anyone could count, Elizabeth became queen. Margaret was still alive then, still watching. She never said it aloud. But perhaps when she saw the red-haired girl ascend the throne, standing straight-backed in her coronation robes, unwed and untamed. Perhaps she whispered something to herself. Not a prayer, not a confession, just a line remembered from a scaffold, or a letter, or a dying woman's lips. Watch over Elizabeth. She had, in her way. She always had. No one ever punished Margaret for the reports. No one asked if she had believed what she had written. No one noticed that her words had been soft where others were harsh, factual where others were damning. Her name faded from court records, as women's names so often do, lost under husbands, under titles, under years. But her words remained, tucked away in the tower's ledgers, archived in dusty parchment, preserved not because anyone cared about her, but because bureaucrats never destroy what they might one day need. And so her careful rebellion, the truth written in a spy's hand, survived. Century later, historians would find them. They would read her notes. They would study her tone. They would see how she stopped echoing Cromwell's narrative and began documenting Anne's humanity. They would call her a reluctant witness, a silent défendé, a woman who had no voice in her own time, but left behind one anyway for ours. And now, when we tell the story of Anne Boleyn, not the myth, not the seductress, not the cartoon version crafted by politics and propaganda, but the real woman, the mother who wept for her daughter, the queen who tied back her hair so the sword would fall clean, and the soul who whispered truth, even when no one would hear it. We owe that story to Margaret Dymoke. She said nothing for 40 years, but her silence was never empty. It held everything she could not risk saying, and now that we can finally say it for her, we remember